Signore e signori, buonasera e benvenuti all'Istituto Svedese. Passo subito in lingua inglese, che è la lingua della serata. Ladies and gentlemen, very welcome to the Swedish Institute of Classical Studies in Rome. My name is Sabrina Nolander Eliasson and I'm the Deputy Director of the Institute. Unfortunately, our director Ulf Hansson has come down with the flu, but he sends his best regards to today's speakers and to the audience, of course. Today's lecture is part of our celebratory events program for the centenary of our institution. And this afternoon we are very pleased and honored to host historian Frederick Whitling, senior member of the Institute and a specialist on our founder, the King Gustaf Adolphus VI, as well as on the early history of the Institute. Frederick Whitling gained his PhD in History and Civilization at the European University Institute in Florence in 2010. He's a writer and researcher, primarily in the fields of the history of archaeology as well as modern Mediterranean history. The span of related topics covered in some of Whitling's scholarly work is indicated by two monographs, both published in 2023, Palais de Sue, from Ottoman Constantinople to Modern Istanbul, and Kulturkungen, Gustaf VI Adolf, från A till Ö, the Culture King, Gustaf Adolphus VI, from A to Z. Whitling is presently conducting a research project on the Swedish Cyprus Expedition that took place in 1927 to 1931 in a historical perspective, and is currently a visiting researcher at the University of Cyprus. Very welcome, Frederick.
Thank you very much. Sabrina, that was a very good resume of a lot of stuff. Buonasera a tutti. It's a great pleasure to be here for this occasion. I hope you can hear me. I'll raise the thing a bit. It is a great pleasure. It really is. Having worked on the history, as was mentioned, of this institution for many years. It's, of course, the centenary, the upcoming centenary was on, at least on my mind and on many others, for some time. And here it is, and I'm very glad, honored, in fact, to be a part of it in this way. So, I'm going to try to make a potentially very long story, not necessarily short, but I'll do my best to try to cover a wide range of topics that all somehow come together, linked, focused perhaps on the persona of the former King of Sweden, Gustaf VI Adolf, whom I shall refer to as Gustaf Adolf. It becomes a bit too much of a mouthful otherwise. The presentation and the title of the presentation is linked to a forthcoming contribution to the review of the Institute, the Opuscula, for the centenary publication, let's say, which is will shortly be in press. And the presentation is, as is that contribution, based mainly on unpublished primary sources, archival material. So the archaeologists publish their pottery, as it were. I publish pieces of paper and photographs and diaries and many other interesting vestiges of the past, let's say. The presentation will deal with the establishment of the Swedish Institute in Rome in the mid-1920s, as you can see here. It will deal with its first director, Axel Boëthius, and, as mentioned, the role of Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf of Sweden. I shall discuss personal influence, sociopolitical surroundings, as well as networks and input of individual scholars. The preparations for the Institute of its history have been covered in a volume written by the two scholars. You can see if I can get this to work. Erland and Ragnhild Billig, the book here on the left, who were both grant holders at the Institute during the Second World War, and this history was completed by myself 10 years ago, more or less. And here you see an image, I took the liberty of including that, of this book in Swedish, which I hope to get translated at some point into English and possibly other languages, which is the result of a 10-year research project on the role of the former King of Sweden, specifically as Crown Prince, specifically as chairman of a number of organizations, including the Swedish Institute in Rome. So, after the end of the First World War, the time was ripe for an investment in a research institute on, quote, classical ground. In other words, preferably in Greece, in Italy, or possibly on the coast of Asia Minor. An institute from one of the Nordic countries, following in the footsteps of the larger cultural nations, France, Germany, Great Britain, the United States, Austria even. The Nordic countries didn't have one yet, and Sweden would take the lead in this regard, not least through Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf, himself educated in archaeology. Here's an early photograph of the prince, as he was at the time, excavating in southern Sweden together with Oskar Montelius, the rather famous archaeologist. And here is a comprehensive list of all of the archaeological projects in which the former king was involved. The ones in bold type are outside Sweden, as you can see, with a number of projects in Italy towards the end of the list. This is a separate topic, essentially. I don't really have time to go into all this now, but only to get an image of the Institute in Rome placed right in the middle of all of this, let's say, from his perspective. The Swedish Institute in Rome was initially discussed as a possible Scandinavian institute in Athens, as a jointly funded Swedish-Danish collaboration. And as we shall see, a research institute in the Mediterranean was discussed from 1921 to 1924, with Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf in a leading role. But a conflict of interests and the aims of this planned inter-Scandinavian institute, however, led to the abandonment of this joint effort by early 1925, as we shall see. The study of classical archaeology and ancient history was established as a discipline at Swedish universities in 1909. This coincided with courses in Rome led by the Latinists Wilhelm Lundström in 1909 and Johan Bergman. Bergman taught 12 editions of a Scandinavian, in quotes, summer course in archaeology, topography and epigraphy in Italy between 1898 and 1924. And Bergman advocated a Scandinavian, or if possible, a Swedish institute in either Athens or Rome, although he interestingly suggested alternative locations such as Thessaloniki, Smyrna, or, quote, somewhere on the Syrian coast, unquote. Rome was ultimately to draw the longest straw, as we know, and this for two main reasons: the collections and archival resources of the Vatican, and the accessibility of Rome, compared to the more remote, quote, semi-oriental Athens. This is arguably still the case today. A parliamentary debate was held, no, I don't mean that Athens is semi-oriental, by the way, but I'm referring to the accessibility. A parliamentary debate was held in 1914 in Sweden regarding the possibility of a permanent presence in Rome. But of course the war, the First World War, put an end to all that. I shall speak for some time here about two characters, Frederick Poulsen in Copenhagen and Martin P. Nilsson in Lund, who began corresponding with each other before the outbreak of the First World War. In 1919, a professor of classical philology in Copenhagen, Anders Bjørn Drachmann, wrote to Martin Nilsson in Lund about his plans for a Scandinavian philological journal. The word Scandinavian is key here, this idea of collaborating after the First World War. In the same year, Lennart Kjellberg, who was Martin Nilsson's professor colleague in Uppsala in Sweden, wrote about a course in Copenhagen that took place at Poulsen's initiative with participants from both Uppsala and Lund. So everybody happily collaborating. Poulsen dedicated a monograph on the oracle at Delphi to Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf in 1919. An earlier work was similarly dedicated to Oskar Montelius, which is rather interesting. Here we see a piece by Martin Nilsson on Fredrik Poulsen and Delphi, as you can see here. And here is an image of Poulsen at his workplace, the Ny Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen. As chairman of the association Nationalmuseet Vänner, you see them here, founded in 1911 by Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf, the Crown Prince announced that he had received the considerable sum of 25,000 Swedish crowns on behalf of the association from an anonymous donor for the, quote, purchase of painted Greek vases, and that Fredrik Poulsen had undertaken to act as an intermediary for such purchases during a trip to Italy. So Gustaf Adolf and Poulsen were definitely quite closely, as it were, collaborating at this point. I'll be throwing a number of names at you, but there's nothing to be done about that. The historian Ludwig Magnus Båth of the Swedish National Archives led a Scandinavian, again, expedition, in quotes, to Rome in 1920, which was a research delegation to the Vatican Archives. Here we see an image of Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf and his then wife, the Crown Princess Margareta, a photograph from Capri. And here is an image from a trip to Greece in 1920. This trip to Greece happened after the tragic death of his wife, Crown Princess Margareta, in 1920, when Gustaf Adolf traveled to Greece with his uncle Eugen, the so-called painter prince. And during this stay in Greece in 1920, contacts were made for an excavation in Greece under Swedish direction, which resulted in a large-scale archaeological undertaking at Asini in the Peloponnese from 1922 to 1930. Here we have two images from Asini. The Crown Prince is always in the middle of these photographs. And, well, a number of images that result from this, including various caricatures. The Asini Committee was formed in 1921 to organize these excavations, with hopes also of a possible Swedish or Scandinavian institute in Athens. So these excavations were connected to the idea of an institute. The first excavation seasons coincided, however, with new restrictions on the export of archaeological material from Greece in 1924, and this definitely played into this whole dynamic. It was no longer possible to export antiquities. Gustaf Adolf simultaneously also took on the chairmanship of the so-called China Committee the same year, which you see there on the right. And his parallel chairmanships has been the subject of my long-term research project. The same year of all of this, the Asini Committee, the China Committee, also the Swedish Orient Society was founded in 1921. Again, no prizes for guessing who was the chairman. Of course, it was Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf. And the society was founded with the express intention of establishing a Swedish institute or research home in Constantinople, just to complicate things even more. So Istanbul. So Athens, Istanbul. Nobody has really mentioned Rome yet, but they will. Lennart Kjellberg, whom I mentioned in Uppsala, wrote to Istanbul, to Constantinople, to Johannes Kolmodin, who was the interpreter Dragoman at the Swedish legation there. He wrote about Martin P. Nilsson and Axel V. Persson, another person, Persson, who I'll introduce again, who, quote, they seem to be most eager to unite with the Danes and establish a Scandinavian institute. And Kjellberg continued, for us archaeologists, Athens is of course the most suitable place from many points of view, but given the choice between a Scandinavian Archaeological Institute in Athens and a Swedish Research Institute in Constantinople, I choose the latter for national reasons. And then he added that Fredrik Poulsen would perhaps become the first director of the institute, or its first organizers, and that can hardly be avoided. He didn't like that. He didn't like that idea. You see here the former apartment of, I say former because it doesn't exist anymore, at the Royal Palace in Stockholm, the apartment of Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf, which was essentially the setting for all of these board meetings, including where the Swedish Institute in Rome was eventually founded. So all of this is on the boil here. Early negotiations for this joint Scandinavian Research Institute in the Mediterranean took place between Martin Nilsson and Fredrik Poulsen in the years, as I said, 1921 to 24. And their contact was quite close. Paulsen was offered to stand in for Martin Nilsson as his professorship at Lund University in 1923, but he couldn't because he was on his way to Greece, and so was Martin Nilsson, and there they met in Athens. Both of them, Nilsson and Paulsen, but also Axel V. Persson, who was one of the excavation leaders at Assini, they were all foreign members, as it was referred to, of the French school in Athens, l'École Française, which was the first foreign school, not only in Athens, but essentially in the Mediterranean of its kind. So in 1923, Paulsen and Nilsson were both there, where they probably discussed the idea of this research institute. Here you see examples of Frederick Paulsen's handwriting, writing to Nilsson. This is all in the archive of Nilsson in Lund. At the same time, Axel V. Persson and Axel Boëthius, here you see Axel Persson, years later, but that's him, were drawn into a competition for the professorship at Uppsala after Lennart Kjellberg. Persson and Boëthius were the two candidates. Sorry. The process dragged on, however, and Axel Persson was eventually appointed professor at Uppsala in November 1924. 6 days later, Fredrik Paulsen turned to Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf, wondering whether now that Axel Boëthius was free, the time might have come to realize these earlier ideas about a Scandinavian institute in Athens. And around the same time, the Swedish research house in Constantinople that had been established in 1922 closed. It simply ran out of money and there were no guests, essentially. I've written about this in a separate publication. So this whole, this jointly funded Scandinavian institution in either Athens or Rome or somewhere else was in itself a groundbreaking idea in a system of national institutes in Rome and Athens. France, Germany, Great Britain, USA, etc. A collaborative Scandinavian one would have been something very new. In 1924, Kjellberg hoped to perhaps, quote, see if I get to experience such a truly contemporary expression of practical Scandinavianism, unquote, adding that Gustaf Adolf was very interested in the plan. Fredrik Paulsen wrote to the Crown Prince, Gustaf Adolf, again in November 1924, about, quote, the establishment of a Scandinavian Archaeological Institute in Athens. Make Boëthius professor. He can represent Sweden in Athens. If Boëthius rents a house in Athens and settles in, I shall get a Danish scholarship, an archaeologist or architect. And I have no doubt that Norway will also be involved, if you think that it is the time for action. A week later, Paulsen wrote many letters. He wrote again to Gustaf Adolf about possible Danish donors for the institute and the need for a place for Scandinavian students in Athens or in Rome, instead of always using these other institutes. They were always full, there was no space. Let not the good thought fade now that the opportunity exists, he wrote. Gustaf Adolf wrote back, saying that yes, he was indeed interested in establishing an archaeological institute in Athens. However, he was unsure if there was enough interest in Sweden in this Scandinavian idea, which is sort of interesting. Axel Boëthius was, in other words, the main candidate to direct this discussed institute. The intended and very obvious chairman candidate was Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf, who in early January 1925 wrote to Martin Nilsson, quote, I've thought about this and find that strong or even decisive reasons speak in favor of Rome. Suddenly. He also referred here to a provisional institute in Rome. Let's start it and see what happens, more or less. Martin Nilsson confidentially informed Axel Boëthius that if they could raise the funds, he would be offered to lead such an institute. A month later, the promised funds were indeed available, and Boëthius received a formal request from Gustaf Adolf. Would he be willing to undertake the assignment? Indeed he was. Here we see Martin Nilsson and Nilsson together with Boëthius in Rome from the Swedish Institute, one of the photo albums here. So, The joint institute in Athens rather than Rome was abandoned suddenly, this idea, and after the new year 1925, Martin Nilsson wrote to Boëthius about, quote, my old idea of an institute in Rome, which he liked perhaps to take credit for. Quote, not only archaeologists, but also art, church, and secular historians could find a connection there. In the same letter, Nilsson also emphasized the significance of getting Gustaf Adolf as a figurehead, more or less as a prerequisite in order to secure its funding. The funding is the big question. There might be some possibility of obtaining a sum privately. If His Royal Highness takes the lead, it might be possible. And it's certainly not impossible to obtain some contribution from Denmark as well, unquote. Nilsson interestingly added that I myself have had the experience that one starts in Greece, but is increasingly forced to move to Rome due to the practical needs of teaching. After all, we have the important task of giving those who are going to be teachers, they're teachers in Sweden or in Denmark, an idea of ancient culture, and there one must primarily connect to Rome. So far everything is well and good, if we had the money. It depends on a patron who has promised to think about the matter, and His Royal Highness promised to speak to him at an appropriate time, unquote. His Royal Highness must have done so, because at the beginning of March 1925, the uncertainty was dispelled, and the patron in question, who wanted to be anonymous, but I'm afraid I'm going to mention him, his name was Birger Fogelberg, managing director, a firm, I think, in Gävle in Sweden, who had also contributed to the Swedish excavations at Assini a few years earlier. He was the big patron here. He donated 10,000 Swedish crowns as a foundation stone for the institute, to the joy of Nilsson and the others. Nilsson wrote, yes, something has really happened. Thus the plans must have come to fruition, adding that, quote, His Royal Highness is very determined for Scandinavian cooperation. This is natural, since the matter was raised by Poulsen, and in fact necessary to call up the necessary funds. Birger Fogelberg, I haven't managed to find an image of him actually yet, made 3 installments of 10,000 Swedish crowns for 3 consecutive years, 1926 to 1928, with a possible additional donation for 1929, if all went well. This, of course, encouraged other donations, such as by Gustaf Adolf himself, anonymously, and by Axel Hallin, the Institute's first treasurer, who donated 5,000 Swedish crowns. This was quite a lot of money in those days. Here we see Frederick Poulsen together with Axel Boëthius in the Campagna outside Rome, and there's Poulsen reading a guidebook or similar in Rome, also from the Swedish Institute archives here. The Danes then were heavily involved in this, and Martin Nilsson went to Copenhagen for a meeting with Poulsen and others at the Glyptotek. He met with him, he met with the chairman of the Rask Ørsted Foundation and the 2 Carlsberg Foundations, the new one and the old one, as it were. At this meeting, it was decided that the Institute in Rome would remain under Swedish management for the time being, but would be open to Danish fellows, and that the new Carlsberg Foundation annually could appoint a fellow and an artist, nota bene, at the Institute. The Danes, here you see a bunch of all this quite extensive correspondence between, this is the handwriting of Gustaf Adolf, you already know the handwriting of Fredrik Poulsen, and this is very characteristic of letters from Martin Nilsson, this sort of stencil version. And you see this unfortunately rather blurry image of an interesting little newspaper article, basically the only one that refers specifically to a Scandinavian institute, interestingly for art history research in Rome. It's slightly confused, as it were, at this point. So, the Danes were willing to provide a fixed annual rental contribution, including for a room for both Danish fellows, with possible additional contributions. So the Institute in Rome was thus intended for Swedish and Danish fellows and students with joint funds, and Birger Fogelberg's donation secured the Swedish side of the matter financially, of which Gustaf Adolf informed Poulsen in March 1925. He also wrote that he was, quote, in agreement with Nilsson regarding Rome, but hoped for future contact also with Greece in some form. So yes, Rome, but we haven't given up the idea of Greece. At the same time, Martin Nilsson reported on what he called inter-Scandinavian character of this planned institute, and, quote, the question of how the directorship should be distributed among the various participating countries, how to rotate the directorship. Nilsson returned to Copenhagen in early May 1925, when a possible architectural scholarship from the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts was discussed, so possibly even an architect might have joined, as it were, at this point. The secured funding for 3 years enabled Gustaf Adolf to draw up a list of names that were called to a first board meeting of the Institute in his private apartment at the Royal Palace in Stockholm. Here you see the signatures of the first board of the Institute, the 2 royal figures, as it were, in the beginning, and the rest you'll have to figure out yourselves. I could always return to this. This list, however, did not include Wilhelm Lundström, who had been considered the person who led the first course to Rome in 1909, but he had declined as he was apparently, quote, unable to collaborate with Martin Nilsson. This is interesting. The Swedish minister in Rome, the ambassador, as it were, Augustin Beck-Friis, was in agreement with the Institute project and gave it his support. In April 1995, he wrote, I'm convinced that the Italian authorities will be pleased to see the establishment of the Swedish Institute. Axel V. Persson hadn't given up on the Norwegians and raised Norwegian interest in the matter. And the Institute was overall highlighted as a means for maintaining Scandinavia's reputation in the classical archaeological Mediterranean world. For that purpose, there were discussions of including Norway and also Finland, an idea that was abandoned due to lack of funding and, in all honesty, lack of students. The planned institute in Rome was formulated as Swedish, certainly with support from Denmark and with Danish students, and the inter-Scandinavian idea was in practice established but formally postponed. After the constituent meeting of the Swedish Institute on 8th of May 1925, Nilsson stated that the matter has now become public. So it was settled and the institute had been established. Like the recent 2025, 1925 was also a Catholic Jubilee year in Rome, and the institute was established in Stockholm less than a month after that year's Easter celebrations. The synchronicity is of course largely a coincidence. And Sweden thus became the first Nordic country to add to the tally of foreign institutes in Rome, an institutional practice that at that time dated back about a century, with of course significant German, French, British, American, other precursors. The potential political implications of establishing the institute in fascist Italy, however, were not explicitly addressed at the time. It was essentially ignored. To some, even, Mussolini was regarded as an overall positive force, and the foreign schools in Rome and the fascist regime had mutual interests in the study of Roman antiquity as well as in Romanità. And it should be said that many of the individuals that set the institute in motion shared a politically and culturally conservative orientation. This is simply the case. There's much more to be said on that another time. Axel Boëthius was then given the task of directing the institute for an initial 3-year period. The money was only there for 3 years. And so he did, from 1926 to 1929. In 1931, the author and journalist Agne Hamrin, foreign correspondent in Rome, interviewed Boëthius about the establishment of the institute. It was a case of, quote, striking while the iron was hot and the iron was struck. The Crown Prince took the initiative. He managed to interest individual donors. In a later interview, Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf, who interestingly I would not include in this group of politically, culturally conservative-oriented figures, just for the sake of it. He was surprisingly, let's say, liberal. In a later interview, he referred to how, quote, he and his friends had considered that, quote, it would not hurt with an element of classical culture in Sweden. This could be found, quote, in Italy, notably in Rome and its surroundings. We thought nothing ventured, nothing gained, and we started with generous private contributions. The institute was established here. I passed by today just to say hello, in Via del Boschetto in the Monti area region. Eventually it moved there to the Palazzo Brancaccio on the Via Merulana before it moved here, of course, where we are this evening. Boëthius organized the institute premises. This is an image from Via del Boschetto in 1926. During the autumn-winter of 1925-26 in a rented apartment in the street, in the Monti district. Interestingly, an alternative location appears to have been a piano nobile at Piazza Barberini. But here we were. They found this apartment. This image is rather interesting. This is Boëthius' own sketch of what the place looked like, which makes it very clear that the two Danish student rooms are the two big rooms, let's say, and there's a Swedish student room squeezed in up at the top, and a balcony and a bathroom, which is quite cute, which means you actually have to go out on the balcony in order to go to the bathroom, I just realized. Modest in scale and ambition, the apartment was later described by Boëthius as, quote, 3 small rooms in the Suburra. He emphasized that the first students at the Institute had an austere and Spartan lifestyle overall, and that they lived in a, quote, companionship like the first Christians. A possible co-location with the Scandinavian Association in Rome, the Circolo Scandinavo, was discussed. Should they move in together? But this was declined by basically everybody, by Chairman Gustaf Adolf, but certainly Martin P. Nilsson, who was quite clear with his own opinion regarding a possible co-location with the Scandinavian Circolo. In other words, with artists, God forbid, in a letter to Boëthius. Quote, I maintain my aversion even to living under the same roof. It could be contagious, unquote. This is a much later image, of course, of Gustaf Adolf together with Bernard Berenson, the famous art historian, in his also famous Villa I Tatti outside Florence. But I include it because Gustaf Adolf wrote to Berenson, who was a personal friend of his, at the turn of the year, 1925-26, in English, that, quote, a Swedish school of archaeology and art has been formed in Rome lately. It's on a very modest scale, but will, I hope, be of use to our students and to our artists, unquote. The director's salary, free scholarship grants for the first 3 years, 1 Swedish, 2 Danish, as you've seen, were covered by these joint Swedish-Danish funds. The institute thus became Swedish, but the tradition established from day one with students and researchers, male and female, also from the other Nordic countries, continued until after the Second World War, until the 1950s, which is quite evident from the first page here of the students. Yeah, it speaks for itself. Images from the first archaeological course of the Swedish Institute in 1926, when the Institute opened its doors in Via del Boschetto on the 1st of February, with a lecture to kick off the annual course in classical archaeology, the first of its kind. And in this first rendition of this course, 2 of the 5 student participants were female, Yvonne Molin and Anna Munk of Rosensköld. It might be mentioned here, I would like to mention specifically that the men in the title of this talk is a reminder that women would not, for example, have been considered for the director position of the Institute at this time. It simply was a different time. But in that perspective, it's interesting that half of the participants almost, it was essentially a joint male-female course. Universal suffrage had only been introduced in Sweden only 5 years earlier, in 1921. Early days, let's say. So everyone seems to be happy here. Boëthius informed Paulsen of the beginnings of the Institute, and Paulsen wrote to Nilsson about the appointed Danish fellows of the Institute. Another of the first course participants was Erik Sjöqvist. You see him up there with a cigarette in his mouth. Quite lovely images. There are so many of these. They're all huddled together in groups, lying on top of each other with various dogs and bottles of wine and what have you. Sjöqvist took part in this first course. When he later became director of the Institute in 1940, Boëthius emphasizes the significance of this annual archaeological course. Quote, who together with the Crown Prince have generated the substantial grants and donations we have received, we know that we have received all this mostly thanks to the courses. Essentially, make sure they continue. Some images of Boëthius teaching in Rome and outside. Pompeii, for example. And I had to include this. This is a rather sweet example of how the archival material can be used in practice. This is about 10 years ago when the archaeological course decided to reenact one of the old photographs, which is quite fun, in the same spirit of essentially humor. The first course participants at the Swedish Institute visited the Circolo Scandinavo, which was, as we know, established in Rome in 1860. It had been around for a very long time, and the Circolo was also viewed as a friendly competition. Boëthius was in fact elected its chairman in 1926, and later reflected on the Institute's humble beginnings and, quote, our conquering of ancient and modern Rome, our freedom struggle for our Rome versus the Scandinavian Association's claim of monopoly for the only right thing, unquote. This he said while being chairman of the association. He stood down as chairman in 1928, although of course he supported it for the rest of his life and emphasized the significance of its library, for example. Friendly competition. Other images, later images of these various archaeological courses with captions such as anywhere, var som helst. And this image, which I believe features Fredrik Poulsen in the middle, a nice party. As mentioned, the Institute was welcomed by the Swedish diplomatic representation in Italy, the minister, Beck-Friis, who was supported by his predecessor, Carl Bildt, as, quote, an active and very useful link in the cultural relations between Sweden and Italy, unquote. An early newspaper article on the Institute affirmed, however, that the institution has nothing to do with semi-diplomatic representation, instead stressing its connections with excavations in Greece. Beck-Friis' successor as minister, Erik Sjöborg, was briefed by Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf himself regarding the Institute in 1928. He wrote, he promised to show an interest. So he'd put his foot down, essentially, and declared what was what. Boëthius suggested Swedish royal decorations to Italian archaeologists as a sweetening instrument, and Sjöborg himself, the minister, indeed soon considered Boëthius a candidate for the Swedish Order of the North Star in 1931, as the reason was that Italian authorities had, quote, favored our institute to a larger extent than has been the case regarding the respective institutions of other countries in Rome. So Boëthius has done a very good job. We should give him a royal decoration. Boëthius was referred to by the literature historian Henrik Schick, who you see here, member of the Institute board and the Swedish Academy, as, quote, our archaeological minister in Rome. So, yeah, semi-diplomatic indeed, in 1932. Wilhelm Lundström, at the same time, emphasized Boëthius' importance as an excellent Swedish cultural representative, in a wonderful way, the right man at the right time. When Boëthius eventually left Rome in 1935, he was indeed referred to as a Swedish Minister of Culture in Rome. His successor, Einar Gärstad, was handed down Boëthius' long list of connections and positions, a list which was, interestingly, could not be located when Gärstad handed over to Sjökvist in 1940. Somehow it had disappeared. Boëthius was in regular contact with Chairman Gustaf Adolf, who was present at the opening of the second iteration of the archaeological course in February 1927, and here you see him with the Institute, as in the men of the Institute, with, I think, one female exception. On the terrace at Via del Boschetto, this is one of the same image in a newspaper feature, a caricature of the Crown Prince, which is actually from Alexandra Bildt's diaries, preserved here at the Institute. So Gustaf Adolf was present in Rome. He signed the book, 1st of February 1927. So did several other people, as you can see here. 2 months later, the so-called Cyprus Committee was established for the Swedish Cyprus Expedition, 1927-31, as was mentioned. I won't go into that. I'll just mention that this is all connected. And 2 of the members of the Cyprus Expedition were, in fact, Einar Gjerstad and Erik Sjöqvist. Gjerstad was the leader of the expedition. And who was the chairman? Well, Gustaf Adolf, of course. The same year, 1927, a residence in Rome for Queen Victoria of Sweden was purchased, the so-called Villa Svezia in Parioli, in fact, sort of a stone's throw from where we are now, not far from the present location of the Institute. The Queen, however, passed away in 1930, and the question of whether the Swedish Institute might take over this villa was raised, but it was refrained from for cost-related reasons. Mainly, it was too expensive. By then, the Institute had already moved to Palazzo Brancaccio in Via Merulana in 1928, where it would remain until it moved in here. Frederick Poulsen accepted to substitute for Martin Nilsson in Lund with some lectures. Their contact continued, even though by 1935, Poulsen wondered if Nilsson had lost interest in the other side of the Öresund Strait. "Will we ever see you in Copenhagen?" He writes. The same year, which I will just mention very briefly, incidentally witnessed suggestions for a Swedish institute in Athens. This was realized after the Second World War. Nilsson and Poulsen together could be said perhaps to represent and embody interwar period regional cooperation, inter-Scandinavian visions, if you like, and transnational Swedish-Danish relations and networks. Martin Nilsson later referred to the establishment of the Institute in Rome as the realization of, quote, "one of my dearest ideas." Again, it was his idea. However, already by 1928, the board of the Swedish Institute initiated, quote, "measures to terminate the cooperation with the Carlsberg and Ny Carlsberg funds." The Institute was initially funded by private donations, as I mentioned, which was followed, which is quite important here, by so-called state lottery funds between 1929 and 1938. So the possibility for these state funds had come up, therefore the Danish money was no longer actually necessary, so to speak. This had to be applied for annually, however. You never knew if you were actually going to get the money. It was quite a complicated situation. And state funding was secured in 1938, just in time for the outbreak, before the outbreak of the Second World War, and a prerequisite for the construction of this building in Valle Giulia. The state funding, the building itself was funded by a donor, Knut Wallenberg. This wonderful newspaper piece states that Swedish classical scientists, as it were, give wardrobes to Rome, somehow implying that there were no wardrobes in Rome. So, at this point, Gustaf Adolf wrote to Einar Gjerstad, who was the director, Boëthius' successor, about our great success. The Institute was now secured for good, unquote. And in this reorganization of the Institute with state funding, Gustaf Adolf became instead honorary chairman. The chairman was the Swedish University Chancellor. Going back to the 1920s again, in an early newspaper article on the Swedish Institute, Fredrik Poulsen referred to, quote, "carefree study years in Rome," to which I think most of us can probably relate. Axel Boëthius underlined the connection to Swedish university life when he described the Institute as, quote, "a Swedish university seminar in topography and history based in Rome." Simple as that. Boëthius later looked back rather romantically on its student life at the Institute as, quote, "completely captured by the music of the centuries and the richness of hearts and the glory of nature in the footsteps of classical authors." He described the Institute as stemming from, quote, "our nostalgia for the sun and the spring." Very, very Nordic perspective, let's say, and regarded Swedish contributions to the study of the Roman past as part of a, quote, "secular tribute, a voice from the north with its own accent, with its own traditions, but inspired by Roman universalism, by the grand and austere harmony of Roman history, and by the inexhaustible richness of the heart of Rome." The center of initiative in the executive inner circle of the board of the Institute focused on the chairman, Gustaf Adolf, together with the secretary, the treasurer, and the university chancellor. According to its statutes, the director of the Institute was, still is, required to be a classical archaeologist. Although, interestingly, Axel Boëthius had no real previous experience of Roman or indeed Italian classical archaeology. On the other hand, neither did anyone else outside of Italian archaeology, on the whole, until after 1945. Before the Second World War, with very few exceptions, foreign archaeologists were not given permission to excavate in Italy, so experience was difficult to have. The Swedish Institute was in that sense founded on a prayer, one which was soon answered, however, because one of the few exceptions to this was a personal permit given to Axel Boëthius, in other words, not to the Institute, in 1929 to excavate at Ardea, south of Rome. You see images here from Ardea. He achieved this through personal contacts with Count David Costantini, at the head of the so-called Associazione Internazionale degli Studi Mediterranei, a short-lived association founded in 1929. Excavations at Ardea continued for the duration of Boëthius' term as director until 1935. He applied for funding for this from the newly established Humanistiska Fonden in Sweden, 1928. And who was in the leading Humanistiska Fonden? Well, of course, Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf. He got the money. Boëthius' personal excavation permit may explain why Gustaf Adolf, however, was not directly involved in this project. Unlike other archaeological commitments in Greece, Cyprus, and elsewhere, this was Boëthius' personal thing. Although Gustaf Adolf visited Ardea in 1933 and expressed the hope that Boëthius might perhaps come across, quote, some untouched tomb. He didn't, but he came across many other things. Excavations at Ardea were eventually continued in the 50s, 1952 to 53, by the Institute director then Arvid Andrén, who had studied architectural terracottas from Ardea when he was a student with Boëthius. In the midst of all this, in 1929, Boëthius wrote to Henrik Schick, whom you might remember, about a possible publication series of the Institute. Quote, when we have something to offer, such as, for example, the Servian Wall. And the Servian Wall, Gösta Sävlund's publication of said wall, became the first volume in the series Acta Instituti Romani Reini Suetiae, 1932. Boëthius was certain that such a publication series would, in time, quote, give us a fine row of studies based on independent investigations of the monuments. And he emphasized the necessity of being here, the value of on-site scrutiny and studies down here, as he put it, in Italy. So a series of monographs and essays in the field of classical archaeology was propelled from Lund by Martin Nilsson. 20 such Acta volumes were published between 1932 and 52, financed by a separate publication fund. The second of these volumes was in honor of Gustaf Adolf for his 50th birthday. And in 1935, the series was complemented by the journal Opuscula Romana, as it was called at the time. These Acta volumes contributed to a body of work of Swedish classical scholars that was referred to by some as the Swedish School, or Scuola Svedese, most closely associated with Sävlund's volume that I mentioned on the Serbian Wall, and also with Einar Gärstad's later excavations at the Forum Romanum that resulted in his renowned early Rome publications. Publications indeed. The Institute, however, had no library of its own at first. It would be difficult to squeeze it in between the Danish and the Swedish room and the bathroom, essentially. And there were a few books, but there was no library. And its students were primarily distributed between the libraries of the German Archaeological Institute and the American Academy. Axel Boëthius set out to recover something of the earlier international collaboration in Roman scholarly circles that had been lost since the First World War. He did this through scholarly exchanges, lecture exchanges, receptions, and the Swedish Institute joined in the ambulating lectures and soirees in the so-called Camerate degli Istituti di Roma, in 1929. At the same time, Boëthius reported that the city bristled with preparation work around the clock for the imminent anniversary of the fascist march on Rome. And Boëthius participated in the fascist celebrations of the 2000th anniversary of Emperor Augustus in 1937. So did many other people. He also set up, which is a separate topic, but an interesting one, a Swedish section of the Instituto di Studi Romani in Gothenburg, as soon as he left Rome. I'm getting towards the end, don't worry. Due to considerable strains on the Institute budget, Einar Gjerstad, Boëthius' successor as director, took the initiative for a Friends Association of the Institute, which still exists, Svenska Rominstitutets Vänner, in 1937. This to sustain the upkeep of its library. So the funding of the Institute, as I said, from these so-called state lottery funds, was in Swedish crowns. This is still a problem today, I gather. The exchange rate of the Swedish crown decreased dramatically in 1936. It was essentially not worth very much. So this Friends Association was founded in order to try to keep the library going, essentially. Also, the proceeds from a limited edition of the Italian oeuvre of the architect-artist Ferdinand Boberg was written by Axel Boëthius, preamble by Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf. All of the proceeds of this book went directly to the Institute and to the library. During the Second World War in 1942, Boëthius again emphasized Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf's role in the creation of the Institute, quote, a successful and notable part of our cultural representation abroad, although the lines of, quote, cultural propaganda were never to be crossed. He reflected on this new piece of Sweden in Rome, and how Gustaf Adolf had summoned him in 1925 and outlined the plan that in essence still holds. Everything was soon to grow. Erik Sjöqvist as director, before we wrap this up. And this image of 5 of the Institute directors together under the wonderful wisteria. Looking back on the 3 first directors of the Swedish Institute in the 50s, Boëthius spoke of himself, Einar Gjerstad and Erik Sjöqvist as, quote, cultural personalities and tribunes for the students. Boëthius also acknowledged Frederick Poulsen and the Danish involvement in the establishment of the Institute. And 40 years after it had opened, in 1966, King Gustaf Adolf thanked Boëthius for his many efforts on its behalf. You gave the direction life from the start. It was you who created the spirit of work and research pleasure. Boëthius indeed returned as director twice in the 1950s, after which the American Academy awarded him honorary lodging. He stayed there for the rest of his life. Sjöqvist, which I will mention here at the end, organized the archives of the Swedish Institute, which is quite interesting. These are now in the National Archives, Riksarkivet in Stockholm. He did this in 1947-48, just before his tenure as director ended, to be, quote, kept sealed at the discretion of the board. And he clearly appeared to have sensed that with time, the Institute might become increasingly relevant to Swedish intellectual history. And he wanted to sort it out. And his other job as librarian was evident in all of this. The archives situation is quite complicated. Correspondence is located in various places. Boëthius' archive is in Gothenburg, Gjerstad's is in Lund, Nilsson's is in Lund, etc. There's an interesting lacuna regarding the Institute, the establishment of, in Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf's archive in the Royal Palace. Material from the early years can instead be found in a folder in the Institute archives in Riksarkivet, which is where this bunch of correspondence with Poulsen and the others exists. Guest books are preserved here, photos are preserved here, and so on. The chairman, Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf, was able to visit this building in Valle Giulia for the first time in 1949 on a private visit as a respectful gesture to the former Italian royal family. As Italy had now become a republic, he didn't want to turn up as a crown prince. But he had never seen the place, so now he did. Boëthius, Gjerstad and Sjöqvist were present, it seems, on this occasion. This is an image from a visit to Ostia, and an image with Einar Gjerstad on the Forum Romanum, investigating the ongoing excavations there. So this is 1949. Gustaf Adolf continued to actively support the Institute when he became king the following year. This image I couldn't resist including, as it's the similarities with receptions today is quite striking. This is from the 25th anniversary in 1951, congratulatory telegrams in Latin from Gustaf Adolf, quite symptomatic somehow. So until at least the end of the Second World War, from the early period, from 1925 onwards, the Institute was more or less synonymous with its director, with few middlemen and even fewer women. Through personal relations with Axel Boëthius, Gjerstad and Sjöqvist, the Institute had direct access to the future head of state. Here he is again visiting the Institute at some point. Interestingly, he's quoted there as King of Denmark, which I think is quite fitting for the whole. The Scandinavian confusion is simply a theme that seems to be, and numerous visits, of course, to the Institute. Here he is inaugurating this plaque with the various donors, which you can see when you enter the building. And this last image is quite a nice one, together with at least two of the directors that I've spoken of here, Axel Boëthius and Einar Gjerstad, and the King and Queen, and Boëthius' wife. So, the first one-man band directors of the Institute were both administrators and scholars and operated in between national sovereignty, institutional structures, individual agency, indeed, one could say, I think with some confidence, as the board's men in Rome. With that, tanti auguri for the Institute, and thank you for your attention.